I think we're going to start, if everyone will take a seat. I just wanted to start. My name is Aziza Ahmed. I teach here at Northeastern University School of Law, and I just wanted to start by welcoming all of you to this exciting event that was done in partnership with Emory Law School and the Vulnerability and Legal Theory Project. And just to say a special thanks to Martha Feynman, even though she can't be here with us this weekend, to Stu Marvel, who helped co-organize everything, to Rachel, who isn't here but is sort of the backbone of the logistics project, and my own assistant, Keith. But we are lucky to have Bobby Adie, Vice Dean at Emory Law School, and Stu as our Emory representatives to welcome us on behalf of Emory as well. So just a couple things before we get started for housekeeping. There are bathrooms over there. We have some snacks, coffee, tea, cheese for you guys on the left. And when Jeremy Paul, the Dean of Northeastern, is going to come and welcome everybody towards the end of this panel, and when he comes, after he comes and welcomes everyone, we'll break and go downstairs for a joint reception with the Future of Legal Scholarship Conference that's going on, and then we'll have dinner downstairs as well. So thank you guys so much for being here. I'll just hand it over to Stu.
Yeah, exactly what Aziza said. So delighted to have you all here and looking very much forward to today and tomorrow. I just wanted to say briefly before Bobby sends another generous welcome from Emory, a few things about the workshop format for those of you who have not attended some of these vulnerability and human condition workshops in the past. Basically, they're really aimed at giving a lot of space to work on emerging scholarship. So I'm going to be quite strict about keeping the time cues so that we make sure we have a lot of time afterwards for discussion. So each panelist will have 20 minutes to present, and I'll be letting you know at 5, 2, and 0 minutes as your paper proceeds. When we do the Q&A, it's quite important to speak into one of the microphones that will be passed around for your question, and for the panelists to then respond into the microphone, because we're recording this all for posterity. It will go into the archives at the Feminism and Legal Theory Project in Atlanta, where we house the workshops that have been happening since 1984. So it's part of this very long-standing feminist tradition. So please do try to get your question into the microphone so we can be recorded. There's some information at the front, which I think most of you have seen. There's a handout on what vulnerability is and what vulnerability is not, which is, I think, especially helpful for folks who have not encountered or worked closely with vulnerability theory in the past. So please feel free to take that and read through. There's also information about a workshop we're having in Leeds, UK this summer on social justice and vulnerability, which you're more than welcome to pick up, and some workbooks for those that would like a hard copy of the papers that we're going to be going through today and tomorrow. So I think that's all. Without further ado, we're delighted to have Bobby Adie give some generous
Just very briefly. So I'm wearing my Martha Feynman name tag today. I'm Bobby Adie, the Vice Dean at Emory, but Martha wanted me to convey her welcome. Unfortunately, she couldn't be here. She apologizes for that. This is really when I've been able to participate in these programs with Martha, as many of you have been doing for 20 or 30 years, they really are incredibly enriching and valuable interdisciplinary opportunities as Stu described, to really sort of nurture the future of legal scholarship that we're talking about next door. You guys are doing. So we're really excited to be part of this as an institution, as Emory, and as part of the Vulnerability and Human Condition Initiative. And I really encourage all of you to enjoy the day and tomorrow and get a great time. So welcome.
Yeah, and just to echo, Martha is so sorry she can't be here. There's a family emergency that she just couldn't get away from Atlanta, but she's gutted. She does not miss these things if you know anything about Martha. Yeah, so, yeah, exactly. So she's really sends her deepest apologies that she can't be here in person. But she'll be watching the video afterwards, so she's here, a ghostly, delighted presence hanging over us all. Okay, in the vest. Okay, you put that back there. We can get started. Oh, actually, so the panel will go in the order as, if that's all right with everyone, as in the schedule, which I don't have in front of me. So we'll start with Joanna Erdman, thank you, who'll be speaking on human rights and the contraceptive imperative. On Rachel Rebouchet with the intersection of human rights and reproductive justice. Noya Rimalt, Between Rights Talk and Reproductive Justice, Abortion Law and the Search for a Common Ground. And then Yvonne Lindgren will talk on From Rights to Dignity, Drawing Lessons from Aid in Dying and Reproductive Rights. Okay, thank you.
Great, thanks. So it's a pleasure to be here, and I wanted to extend my thanks to the organizers of this workshop, so Martha, Aziza, and Martha in absentia, Stu and Aziza, as well as Rachel, for convening, organizing, and hosting the workshop. And second, also to thank all of the participants for a fabulous set of papers. I certainly learned a lot, and no doubt I stand to learn much more over the coming days. So to that end, I've prepared my presentation to raise some of our shared questions and themes from the workshop papers. So this paper is based on my experience in the global reproductive rights field, and it's research on the field, which is where I call home, and it's where I've been working largely as a participant observer, trying to understand my environment and also to try to understand the dynamics of change. The project focuses on an emergent discourse in the field, and that is of human rights in or human rights to family planning. And in fact, the first place I presented this work was at the University of Washington at a conference that was entitled The Right to Family Planning. And I took the title of the conference into my presentation to ask, is family planning truly our end goal in a human rights agenda? Is this what we strive to achieve? And if it's not, then why do we no longer name our end goal? So this question is not entirely new to the field. Others have asked it too in different ways. For example, FP 2020 is a global initiative which by its very acronym caused quite a controversy. And that is to enable 120 more women to use contraceptives by 2020. So activists raised alarm at the target measures and the fear of a return to coercion in family planning. And you had this major mobilization in the field to ensure that new and expanded contraceptive programs and services reflected human rights of choice and access. So free and informed consent, privacy, non-discrimination, information, and so forth. And in full disclosure, I participated in this work, especially with the WHO, in producing valuable human rights guidance for the health sector. And I did so because I believe this work is incredibly valuable. International recognition of rights of choice and access with respect to information and services is a formidable achievement in the field. But again, the upsurge in this work left me wondering, is this the most we ever hoped for in our human rights agenda? Rights to choice and access within healthcare programs and with respect to health information and services. And my concern, briefly stated, was that such interventions address the effects but not the causes of structural injustice in the field. And as such, they're critically necessary, but also they are terribly inadequate. Because it's true, by freeing women from the cycle of pregnancy, childbirth, and care, access to contraceptives will allow women to participate in education and the labor force, to better care for their children and families, to improve their own health and well-being. Contraception does allow women to better survive the world, however unjust its conditions. But again, is the right to survive the worst effects of an unjust world all our human rights offer? And if so, what are the consequences of that offering? A discourse of choice and access that empowers individual women to take control over their lives, which gives them the right to decide, a right to found a family, in conditions that preclude meaningful exercise of those rights. Well, that seems to me almost a cruel gesture. And more importantly, it's a gesture that threatens to legitimate the conditions under which they do live and labor, to relieve the state and others of responsibility for those conditions, and to forestall collective action to change them. And so, like so many other fields in human rights, I began to think about and see the depoliticizing dynamics of human rights in family planning. And I set out to track these dynamics, how a human rights discourse of access and choice depoliticizes the causes of human rights violations, and to ask with what effects. And so this is what I'll present today, using 4 basic themes to structure the research: occlusion, minimalism, responsibility, and legitimation. But before I start, I wanted to share with you the fact that when I first presented this at the University of Washington, a conference organizer tweeted at this moment in my talk, "Erdman says the field is too politicized." And I thought, how can she possibly tweet that after I just announced my intention? But I think this is the rationality of the field. And it's so deep that no alternative is possible, and therefore no alternative is heard. So my first theme, occlusion. I started to track how a human rights agenda of access and choice hides the more primary conditions that make access possible and choice rational. And I started to do so while working within a larger global rights organization on expanded access and advocacy around LARCs. So these are long-acting reversible contraceptives, injectables, IUDs, and implants. And this advocacy tends to trade on a human rights argument of universal access. LARCs are a means to reach those with the greatest unmet need for family planning, namely disadvantaged and marginalized groups. But as I started to work through the contemporary literature on LARCs, which includes very little human rights analysis, let alone critique, I asked, how do we measure unmet need among these groups? And therefore, how do we justify targeted interventions to reach them? So throughout many of the workshop papers, there was this idea about certain constructs or certain concepts that are used to refract vulnerability. And often these are legal concepts or constructs. But in the human rights and family planning field, this is also true, but the concepts tend to derive more from public health and then are incorporated into the human rights discourse. And unmet need is one of those concepts. So on an individual basis, when a woman tells a provider that she is not practicing contraception, though she is at risk for and wants not to become pregnant, she is said by definition to have an unmet need. And on a population level, when we look at unmet need, we tend to look for causes of that discrepancy between intention and action. And we tend to focus particularly on health behaviors or outcomes. So, greater risk of unwanted pregnancy due to sexual violence, greater service access barriers due to discrimination, a reduced capacity to cope with the consequences of unwanted pregnancy. This is what defines unmet need among these social groups. But my question was, when, if ever, do we ask what creates these needs? And more rare still, what distributes these needs unequally among these social groups? So why are these women at risk of sexual violence? Why can these women not access services? Why are these women less able to cope with unwanted pregnancy, less able to access safe and lawful abortion, more affected by loss of education and employment should they choose to keep their pregnancies? What are the causes of unmet need? And we know them. They're the socioeconomic arrangements that impoverish and endanger women in their everyday lives: exclusion and exploitation in the labor market, sexual division of care work, gender dimensions of economic restructuring. When so many women's lives remain quasi-feudal, when to support themselves and their dependents to meet basic subsistence needs, women must enter into relations of economic dependence through unpaid reproductive and sexual labor. The question is, how can you speak of choice in those conditions? When family planning takes from a woman her only means of survival, her only form of social security, again, how can you speak of choice? And where women's lives are marked by endemic poverty, racism, and violence, such that contraception painfully seems to them and is often made to seem to them their only responsible choice, again, how can you speak of choice? So these are the needs that drive individual preference in the timing, spacing, and planning of pregnancy, but the definition of unmet need completely denies this reality. It accounts only for the preferences themselves. And you can consider the increasing practice of disowning the very term family planning. And this is, again, on a human rights rationale of inclusion and non-discrimination. No, we shouldn't use the word or term family planning. We should use contraceptive information and services. This is to universalize the field. It's not about women or families, but individuals. The problem, of course, is this practice ignores the social organization of reproduction, the social institution of the family, and the role of gender within each. This universalizing impulse imagines away the political reality and salience of the categories family and women as critical categories to understand these structures of choice. And so in this practice, not only are the structures of choice unseen, so too are the interests that sustain these structures. Because unmet need is not an aberration. There is a systemic and material basis for unmet need. The global economy thrives on it and depends upon it, compelling and restricting different women's fertility as part of its very logic. And so often the claim is made, family planning's a no-brainer, a win-win for all, a benefit for all, but this is not true. The structural conditions of women's reproductive lives are maintained because they benefit some, even as they profoundly disadvantage others. There is a market in the vulnerability of unmet need. And so here I'm thinking of McCall's work, the analysis around sex work, and questioning whether it could equally apply to the freedom of motherhood as labor. I'm also thinking of Linda and others who shared a concern about universalizing vulnerability and what this might mean for projects of social justice. Now, I think it would be wrong to characterize the field as denying the relevance of structural causes. More often what happens is, after registering this fact, it's set aside. No, that reality is too bleak, that task is too large. And so instead, human rights actors turn to smaller, more manageable projects. And this is my second theme, minimalism. There's a strong tradition in global reproductive rights to focus on public health-related risks and harms. So to address unwanted pregnancy as a simple descriptive cause of harm or suffering. And then position human rights interventions like access and choice in family planning programs as pragmatic public health measures to address those harms. And by doing so, human rights can avoid or bracket these larger intractable structures of contraceptive need. So consider again advocacy on expanded access to LARCs. We're told that LARCs can be used stealthily in a violent or abusive relationship. And if a patient worries that her partner may feel the strings of an IUD, well, they can be cut shorter. I think there's something jarring in the matter-of-factness of this counseling, that we counsel on family planning methods to accommodate or to survive violence. Again, I don't deny the critical value of family planning as a harm reduction measure, but I ask about the kinds of politics that this inscribes. It even inscribes it in the very design of contraceptive technology. Shorter strings, undetectable, access by stealth. And I'm thinking here of Noya's paper where, again, is access by dishonesty, evasion, or secrecy a human rights approach or agenda? The concern, I think, is by setting our agenda so we meet critical needs in the here and now, but again, we neglect the structures that continue to produce and reproduce those very needs. And this is a very common feature of harm reduction. It has a rather ambivalent relationship to structural reform. Because by working quietly in private spaces, providing the means to care for oneself, human rights as harm reduction produces a reproductive politics of individual survival. And this survival often morphs into empowerment, but it is always true that it is individual responsibility. And so this is my third theme, responsibility. Human rights and family planning trade in individual empowerment and individual responsibility. That when women have agency, they can protect themselves and define for themselves the lives they want to live. This, after all, was the dream of the magic pill. Advertisements for the first oral contraceptives showed the image of the mythical persona Andromeda, who was breaking free from the manacles around her wrist to symbolize the liberation of women from the threat of pregnancy. But imagine that our human rights are premised on the mythical lives of Greek gods. So configured, human rights vest all the power, but also all the responsibility within the individual. And so this theme returns again to the structures of reproductive injustice, but from a different view. One that validates the women who negotiate these conditions and structures. One that acknowledges their agency in this negotiation, understanding contraceptive need and use as negotiated interests in this larger calculus. So think, for example, the ways in which women, often in rural contexts, use their sexuality to generate cash and fill the income gap left behind in restructured male work, often through sex work. or how they use fertility to tie a man to them for economic security through traditional gender roles. Women are treated here not as vulnerable, but as people who act rationally, as empowered and responsible agents, and for whom contraceptives are a critical social and economic resource. But the question is whether human rights should accept, if not celebrate, this fact. The concern is that powerful actors will use this ideology of individual responsibility, as expressed through human rights of access and choice, to deny responsibility for the hard conditions of people's lives. The burden of responsibility will become the entitlement of human rights. Which leads to my last and fourth theme, legitimation. A human rights agenda in family planning is premised on an ideal that individuals look out for themselves, that each is capable and responsible for their own well-being, which trades in the very same set of beliefs that sustain the dominant social and economic relations of women's inequality. We're told that the less women are burdened by reproduction through an open market of unlimited choice in contraceptive methods, the more liberated women are to enter and engage in the labor market, the productive economy. Reproduction is identified as the cause of women's oppression, and open, unrestricted markets as the best way to guarantee women's equality, freedom, and security. And so I share, I think, with the concern that Deborah has about the prospects of individual non-discrimination discourse and its capacity to achieve social justice. We know all too well that markets alone, to ensure a just distribution of basic conditions of survival, have and will never work. In the family planning context, though, I think there is a strong history to explain the turn away from state or public provision, namely the deplorable history of coercive government programs. But nonetheless, there's been too little attention to the growth of private donors and NGOs in the supply and delivery of contraceptives as public goods. And I say this not because the state has turned away. No, the state has not forsaken its obligation to women. It has simply chosen these means to deliver it. And there are consequences, not only for individual access and choice, but consequences for democratic power and collective action. Because health systems are critical sites and institutions of democracy. They are and should be designed by the people they are intended to serve. And as such, healthcare rights are ultimately political rights. They're entitlements to be fully included in the collective life of society, to have one's health and well-being protected by those social institutions, and in turn, to participate in shaping those institutions. And so this is the political, the collective, the democratic power of reproductive rights, the means to negotiate one's full and equal citizenship. But this democratic power is lost when reproductive rights are reduced only to rights of access and choice within the field of family planning. When reproductive rights are delinked from the roles and status of women in homes and societies. And by this I mean delinked from rights to a secure livelihood, rights to own and control property, the right to rest, to be alleviated from the extreme burdens of housework, to enjoy sexuality, to be free from violence, and to participate as an equal and free citizen in one community. These, I think, are the political, social, and economic conditions of life, and ultimately should be our reproductive rights agenda. Thank you.
So I want to add my thanks to Aziza and to Stu and to Martha, her ghostly spirit, as Stu said, who's with us today, and to Rachel for organizing this workshop. I've really enjoyed reading the papers, and I'm delighted to be here. So my project examines the invocation of human rights in writings about the reproductive justice movement. In my time, I'd like to first describe what the inspiration for my paper is, how my project started, and then briefly outline my arguments before concluding with what I see is this project's challenges and questions moving forward. This work actually started as a book proposal for NYU Press. I had written about comparative abortion law, and the editor of their Family and Gender series asked me to submit a proposal on reproductive justice and international abortion reform for a U.S. audience. So a pretty narrow project. I started with the path of least resistance. I cobbled together what I had already written. And that's how the proposal began. But then I began updating my materials on international reproductive rights advocacy, and I was reading further and more deeply about the trajectory of reproductive justice as a movement. And the idea for this research came to mind, and this workshop worked out perfectly to vet this, this new project. What I saw was in descriptions of the commitments of the reproductive justice movement, particularly here in the United States, there is a consistent attachment to human rights, but not necessarily with any criticism of human rights, with any of the criticism to human rights approaches. So, for example, I recently saw a documentary. One of the founders of the reproductive justice movement was interviewed, Loretta Ross of the Sister Song Collective, who described reproductive justice in this way. Quote, "We took reproductive rights and we took social justice and we just combined them. We came up with reproductive justice and we always had human rights in mind." This is interesting because a skepticism of rights-based approaches, I argue, pervades reproductive justice in the United States, particularly in criticisms of mainstream reproductive rights movements here. And I should just say from the outset, I consider myself part of those movements. I'm a former lawyer for a nonprofit that worked on reproductive justice and reproductive rights issues, and I'm still involved in many of those organizations. I write this paper because I'm worried about the infrastructure for reproductive health services in this country. So this project is a first attempt to figure out how human rights rhetoric and reproductive justice intersect in a moment of abortion rights advocacy. And I think what gets left behind, and I'm going to argue today that what's left behind is a robust theory of economic inequality. Okay, so first, the first part of the project sets out the treatment of abortion rights and human rights law, looking specifically at the International Conference on Population Development, the Fourth World Conference on Women, the documents produced at those events, two more recent declarations on reproductive rights. I argue abortion rights have gone pretty far at the level of international convention drafting and interpretation. This has been accomplished by tying abortion rights specifically with women's human rights to equality, autonomy, and dignity generally, tapping into a much deeper, longer history than I have time to describe here about women's rights on the international level. So in many ways, international human rights law has helped move states from ensuring women's access to safe abortion when legal, to urging states to permit or decriminalize early abortion or abortion on certain grounds. So is this abortion on request? No, it's not. But is it a big step forward from 1994, 1995? I think so, and I think human rights have been indispensable to making the case for abortion permission. Next, I draw from contemporary cases that draw out what human rights work accomplishes in the last 20 to 30 years. I discuss these national high-profile cases to figure out how human rights are justifying and legitimating law reform in very diverse places and across diverse jurisdictions. And what's notable is how consistent human rights arguments are despite the differences in political economies and cultures in various countries. And I map three ways in which that legitimation occurs. First, and this draws in some ways from Joanna's comments as well, courts evoke universal independent values associated with women's human rights. Then courts depend on human rights as a mode of communicating modern agreement among like-minded countries. So to place a country within a regional consensus or to explain why neighboring states' laws are retrograde in comparison to others. And finally, very apt for rights-based considerations, Courts deploy human rights protections as a shield and a sword in the face of anti-abortion opposition. So we know the story of human rights too, rights as trumps, rights and weighing interest. I then note that there have been various critiques of these human rights strategies and of human rights litigation, though not necessarily as robustly, I argue, made in the transnational reproductive rights context. And I'm not, I would say I think that makes sense. When I've talked to people about this idea and this project, they say, what are you doing? Rights are fragile, particularly reproductive justice. All wins are fragile victories. Just look last summer at the right to life being debated by the Human Rights Committee, in which there was an onslaught of anti-abortion activism trying to get the committee to, and I see that. I think that there is something to be said for the fragility of reproductive rights at the international or at any level. But I think that two criticisms of those strategies are worth bearing in mind nonetheless. They are salient. The first that I think I draw from the literature critical of human rights is the way in which human rights presents itself but is not value neutral or politics free. It embeds presumptions and values about what is modern, what is consensus. It's often informed by the priorities and politics of the global north. There's a conservatism and an imperialism that pervades human rights that I think has been well documented in other literatures. And then second, even when you win victories, litigation over abortion laws in courts, for example, those wins may not produce the expected changes you wanted in the local delivery of services. And it may not answer questions about infrastructure or resources, especially in an area that's so closely tied, at least in the present, to the delivery of healthcare services. And we can discuss in Q&A if this is a state's unwillingness or inability to implement rights, or something inherent in rights claims, or all of the above. So I don't think that advocates or academics even have ignored these critiques. In fact, what I think is so compelling about the reproductive justice framework is I think it has taken up some of these criticisms, though, in a different way. So in the last part of this presentation, I just want to briefly note the origin of reproductive justice as I read it in writings about reproductive justice in the United States, the commitments of the movement, and then where I think there's tension between those commitments and human rights strategies. So I trace reproductive justice origin story, which according to many came together for NGOs at the ICPD and was led by organizations like Sister Song, like the Asian Communities for Reproductive Justice, which had been urging that the strategies of mainstream feminist and reproductive rights organizations in the United States particularly excluded women of color, excluded women with low incomes and other marginalized populations. And the three commitments that I think are relevant to my argument of the reproductive justice movement, the first is a critique of choice, that specifically a critique of privacy rights. So this draws from decades-long work of feminists and others who have argued that a right is very limited if one cannot gain access to it or pay for it, that it's stunted and unrealistic to ground a right to choose or a right to privacy in individual decisions, which is also nice to go after Joanna for that reason as well. Second commitment, I think reproductive justice writings in APSI seek to include a host of issues, a range of issues of reproductive health care and rights outside of abortion, beyond abortion. So assisted reproductive technologies, sex ed, postnatal, prenatal care, child support, child care support, the treatment of incarcerated women. The list is long, but it does not start and end with abortion. And then finally, reproductive justice, I think, is consistent in its calls for grassroots and community responses to the delivery of reproductive health care, including abortion. So though the agenda is not entirely about abortion, abortion's still on the list. And looking beyond in that service provision, in that grassroots and community response, beyond courts, lawyers, and the law. So here I'm fascinated, and I'd want to note the recent attention, at least recent public attention to self-induced abortion, which has been a fascination of mine for a while. How reform chills extralegal abortion methods such as misoprostol and other means of terminating a pregnancy. I think the era is ending in which U.S. advocates can ignore self-induction. Litigation on trap laws in this country bring a fascinating insight into the practical impediments of abortion services, bringing self-use and its consequences really into the conversation. Some really great work happening at Berkeley around self-induction. Okay, and so then I want to conclude with what the observation that I think really drives my project and the paper that you read. So within these movement commitments, reproductive justice embraces human rights. Throughout the literature on reproductive justice, I've noticed the reference to 3 generations of rights: civil, political, socioeconomic, 3rd generation, the reference to positive duties and the obligation on states to implement rights. The Sister Song Collective, for instance, hands out the Universal Declaration on Human Rights as part of its grassroots mobilization, and I think that the way in which I read human rights rhetoric in these materials parallels in some interesting ways the way in which human rights are talked about and used by courts and by advocates in front of those courts that another part of the paper addresses. So what I'm trying to do now is marry those human rights, that human rights rhetoric with the commitments of the reproductive justice movement. So first, I think that the embrace of human rights is of a somewhat dated notion of human rights advocacy. And my worry about that piece of the human rights rhetoric of the reproductive justice movement is I think it may actually ignore the U.S. legacies of human rights strategies. So I argue there's a bidirectional influence of the United States, citing in other work how courts refer to Roe as a progressive model of abortion law reform, but seldom refer to any of the cases or restrictions that happened after. And at the same time, U.S. advocates look to human rights to try to fill out or expand or to augment United Statesian interpretations of constitutional rights. And I think what might get left behind is what reproductive justice also calls for, which is adopting a developing world perspective, to use a quote. I think it certainly leaves behind, in some ways, meaningful engagement with a post-colonial critique of these human rights strategies as used in the field of reproduction. Second, I think invoking broad and vaguely defined rights may end up relying on lawyers and courts to fill out their meaning. So human rights as a language of social justice without any of the critique. Why does this matter? Well, because, and finally, I think at the level of grassroots and community organization, reproductive justice has powerful arguments for closing the gap between law and practice, especially for marginalized and vulnerable populations of women. But I worry that human rights may not deliver the resource distribution that's necessary to affect people's standard of living. So here is where I need all of your help, because I'm turning in this part of the project to work on the social determinants of health, which is something I've thought about in another context. because I'm motivated by strategies that will get at the widening income gap in the United States and the staggering levels of economic inequality in this country. So briefly, social determinants of health are the class and income inequalities that perpetuate cycles of poor health and poor access to health resources. They're addressed in some detail in public health literature. Strategies for law that address social determinants really boil down to this: when individuals have income security, their health improves. When you increase income at the lowest end of the socioeconomic scale, you get the greatest improvements in population health. And so part of this is also wrestling with why there is a gap between legal text and public health research in this area. So I look at income transfer strategies affected through the tax system, the impact of those policies on reproductive health, and I think the next step for this project is to think about a similar strategy in the abortion care context, which I think reaffirms the reproductive justice impulse to think holistically about the causes of poor health or poor access, from contraception and sex ed all the way to environmental and employment laws. So I'll leave that for for discussion a question as I conclude. Does it matter if we use the words human rights or not? Especially if human rights are being used to contest or resist neoliberalism or current power structures? I'm going to answer the question briefly. I think it does. I think it matters because I think there's a need to move from the generalizable to the more concrete and to expose what we take for granted in our advocacy strategies. And I'll stop there. Thank you.
So I guess it's my turn, and I'm delighted to be here, and I'm very grateful for all the efforts that were made to accommodate me in the last minute. I would also say that the paper that I distributed is part of a much longer article. We were asked to send out, to distribute short papers, so I condensed the article, but for those of you who are interested, I'll be delighted to distribute the full version of the article in which I fully developed my arguments. So what inspired this article? Just to give you a brief background, I was visiting Georgetown Law Center a couple of years ago, and back then Robin West, who's by the way talking in the other room, she's participating in the other conference, she was writing her piece From Choice to Reproductive Justice that was later published in the Yale Law Journal. And this piece is a call for legislative and policy solutions to abortion. And specifically, what she argues is that conceptualizing legal abortion as an individual constitutional right and relying on adjudication as the strategic vehicle for developing and justifying this right has not served women well. Because with Roe on the books, abortion is becoming less and less available. So rather than promoting reproductive justice, the constitutional right to choose to have an abortion undermines the case for protecting the positive reproductive needs of men and women. And these critical insights lead West to conclude that engaged politics and civil compromise on abortion at the legislative level can better achieve the goal of establishing a positive network of reproductive support for both men and women. Now, coming from Israel, I was intrigued by this anti-rights sentiment. I was also intrigued by the manner in which West critique joins a growing body of literature that questions the wisdom of Roe versus Wade. This literature often relies on comparative examples in an attempt to argue in favor of compromise solutions to the issue of abortion that are not centered upon a right stock. I don't know how many of you know, but one of the earliest examples of this body of work is the normative and comparative work of Mary Ann Glendon that dates back to the late 80s and early 90s. And basically, it is a work that was inspired by the apparent relative calm of abortion politics outside the United States. And she conducted a search for alternative to Roe by comparatively studying abortion laws in 20 Western countries, highlighting the benefits of strategic legislative compromises in this arena. And in her second work, entitled Right Stock, she focused more generally on the American preoccupation with individual rights and argued that right stock inhibits dialogue that might lead toward consensus, accommodation, or at least the discovery of common ground. And referring to abortion as one telling example in this context, she argued that constitutionalizing the abortion issue produced the worst of all possible solutions, in that it left women their constitutional right to privacy, but little else. And in contrast, the argument was that compromise statutes in other Western countries gave a substantial protection to women's interests, such as public funding for abortion and social support for maternity and child raising. And her arguments inspired over the years a significant body of comparative literature that embraced her conclusion regarding the benefits of legislative solutions to abortion. Now, the Israeli abortion legislation is not discussed in this extensive body of literature. However, I think that this case study can shed a more nuanced light on the strategic desirability and normative coherence of arguments favoring statutory and conciliatory solutions to abortion. And therefore, I think it provides a necessary and a valuable starting point from which to debate arguments in favor of compromise solutions to abortion that are not rights-centered. And just to clarify this last point, I need to say a few things on the details of the Israeli abortion law and on the historical compromise that facilitated its enactment back in the 70s. So the current abortion law in Israel was enacted in 1977 as an amendment to the penal law. It imposes a general criminal prohibition on the performance of abortions, while authorizing abortion termination committees consisting of 2 physicians and a social worker to approve abortions under one of 4 criteria. The first is the woman is under marriage age, which is 18 or over 40. The second is that the pregnancy is the result of criminal, out of wedlock or incestuous relations. The third is the fetus is likely to have a physical or mental defect. And the fourth is the continuation of the pregnancy is likely to endanger the woman's life or cause her physical or mental harm. So in sum, there are 2 medical grounds for abortion, an age-related ground, and what I call a status-related ground that in fact covers 3 distinct groups of women: single women, married women who conceived in situation of adultery, and women who conceived as a result of rape or incest. Originally, there was another criteria, a socioeconomic criteria, that determined that abortion could be approved when family or social conditions dictate the abortion, but it was abolished shortly after the law was enacted. So just to give you a context for this law, Israel started debating its current abortion law in the early 70s, and of course, from a cross-national perspective, the 70s is a very important decade with regard to abortion reform. And the primary example is Roe, of course, that acknowledged for the first time a woman's constitutional right to terminate a pregnancy on demand in the first trimester. Israel reformed its abortion law shortly after the American Supreme Court decision in Roe, and it is clear that the Israeli legislators were aware of the details of this decision. Nevertheless, the two countries ended up taking very different paths to resolving the abortion issue. In contrast to Roe, the reformation of Israel's abortion law was the product of a compromise at the legislatures that conceptualized the need for abortion reform in terms that are at odds with any concept of individual rights. The primary motivation for reform in Israel was the desire to remedy a demonstrated dysfunction of the country's first abortion statute. This law originated in British mandatory legislation, and it criminalized the performance of all abortion. And the relevant figures at the time indicated that the law was mostly ignored and black market abortion flourished. And these figures were a source of particular demographic anxiety for policymakers and legislators concerned with the size of the Jewish population in the newly established country. So in reforming the old abortion law, legislators sought to introduce a measure of governmental control in an area in which legal norms had largely ceased to matter. So individual rights discourse was not at all a driving force in triggering the abortion reform in Israel. And why, and just to explain why was it, this relates to two significant characteristics of Israeli law and society in the early 70s that you should be aware of. And the first is that what was very prevalent in those days was national and patriarchal perceptions that ascribed women the duty to contribute to the nation's growth by fulfilling their maternal role. And these perceptions were fed by national concerns over declining population growth and the differential fertility rates between Arabs and Jews. At the same time, it was viewed as equally imperative to discourage high birth rates among poor Jewish families. So increased governmental commitment to pregnancy termination law enforcement was perceived to be an important measure in promoting both pro-fertility and family planning state interest. And a second characteristic of Israeli legal system that shed light on the manner in which most Israeli legislators approach the issue of abortion was the lack of a constitution and a Bill of Rights. Israel did not adopt a written constitution upon its establishment, so legislation that was drafted in the 70s was formally immune from judicial review. And also, in the absence of a guiding framework of constitutional rights, legislators were not accustomed to taking into account the normative restraints of individual rights while formulating new legislation. So this characteristic of Israeli law and society contributed to the relative marginality of the feminist movement in those years and rendered arguments in favor of gender equality negligible and ineffective in shaping public discourse. So although the original political call for abortion reform back in the 70s came also from advocates of women's rights in the Israeli parliament, the Knesset, and although these forces called for a legislative reform that would recognize a woman's right to abortion, they soon realized that Roe represented a legal framework for abortion to which Israeli women could not be given access. In the absence of an Israeli constitution and Bill of Rights, the formation of the abortion legislation depended exclusively on a majority vote in the legislature, one shielded from judicial review. So under these circumstances, advocates of gender equality estimated that right stock could hinder the potential for abortion reform. if they wanted to facilitate the enactment of the abortion reform that would legalize abortions based on a broader array of grounds, they had to search for a common ground with the majority of legislators. So the strategic compromise they made was to set the rights agenda aside and to articulate their arguments in support of the proposed reform in a language that would better resonate with the concerns of the majority of legislators. In practice, this meant uniting behind the demographic agenda and arguing that creating a more realistic and enforceable legal framework for abortion will protect the country's vital need for population growth, because the proposed pregnancy termination committees will be in a better position to monitor and control pregnancy terminations compared to the present situation in which black market abortions flourished. From the perspective of advocates of gender equality, this was a desirable compromise, primarily because of the socioeconomic ground for abortion that was part of the proposed reform. As I said earlier, this ground determined that abortion could be approved when family or social conditions dictate the abortions. So pro-choice advocates believe that adding socioeconomic grounds for abortions as part of the proposed reform would practically address the needs and interests of most women seeking abortions. The relevant data at the time indicated, and by the way, this is true until today, that the majority of abortions are performed because of familial, economic, or social reasons and are not medically or criminally related. So the proposed socioeconomic clause was considered by the bill's sponsors to be a significant expansion of women's legal access to abortion, and therefore was seen as a reasonable trade-off for Roe Rightstock. And under these circumstances, the primary challenge for advocates of gender equality in the Knesset was to rhetorically frame the rationale for abortion reform, and especially for adding a socioeconomic ground for abortion, in a way that addressed the concerns of most legislatures, which they did. The ones who fiercely opposed the socioeconomic clause were religious members of the parliament. And just a clarifying comment about Jewish law and abortion, as opposed to the Catholic faith, Jewish attitudes towards abortion are more nuanced and revolve around a distinction between necessary and unnecessary abortion that rests on the supremacy of maternal life in Jewish law. So religious opposition to the law in the parliament did not mirror the typical Western pro-life stance. And in addition, central to the religious position were halachic perceptions and interests concerning the purity and the wholesomeness of the family. And in the framework of such perceptions, it was easy to rally the support of a religious member of parliament to permit abortions in cases where the pregnancy did not stem from circumstances of a traditional family, such as single women's pregnancy or pregnancy of married women in situation of adultery. So eventually most of the opposition of the religious member of the parliament was directed toward the socioeconomic ground, and their arguments against it were not in any way right-based, that they were motivated by concerns regarding the future of the Jewish people, the value of large family, and the role of women as the guardians of the family. So most secular members of parliament endorsed the socioeconomic clause. Most religious members of parliament oppose it. But even when opinions were divided, and that's really interesting, they basically spoke the same language, in a sense that they agreed that an area of considerations relating to the Jewish collective should determine the appropriate legal scope of abortion regulation. And this unifying framework that lacked any reference to abortion as an individual right had an immediate problematic implication for women. The socioeconomic clause was repealed shortly after the enactment of the law. I don't have enough time to get into details, but I'll just basically say that what happened is the same rhetoric that was used when the law was enacted was recruited again to justify the repeal of this clause. So when the socioeconomic clause was repealed in 1979, and this is how the law looks until today, it became a very narrow law. It was basically an unworkable law in the sense that it didn't at all respond to the needs, to the reproductive needs of women, primarily married women. As I said, single women had full access to abortion because there is a ground for abortion that allow access to abortion when a woman is not married, because this is not a traditional family model. So single women have full access. Married women were fully dependent on the socioeconomic clause. Once it was repealed, they were basically denied access to abortion. And what developed next is what I describe in the paper, a culture of lies, or the emergence of the adulterous woman. And this is basically a pattern in which married women have to rely on the adultery ground for abortion, which allows some manipulation, because what you have to do, you have to come in front of the committee and declare that you committed adultery, and the pregnancy is a result of adultery. And in the full version of the paper, I provide all the numbers that support my claim that basically this is what's going on today. There is this ongoing culture of lies. In addition, in the broader paper, I analyze other comparative examples, Canada, France, and Germany, that I argue basically support my final claim. And the final claim, and was this, I will end, is that when abortion rights don't talk, when you don't have the rights framework that give the context and framing for abortion legislation, neither gender equality nor gender justice can be fully realized. Thank you.
Thank you so much for inviting me to participate. I am absolutely thrilled to be here. The paper I'm presenting was recently accepted for publication at Utah Law Review, and so I am in the process of revising and rewriting it. And so I am excited about engaging this conversation today so that I can get some ideas about how to deepen my thinking about this this overlay between the reproductive justice framework and vulnerability theory. So I'm going to take our discussion and literally start working on it in the following weeks, because I'm on a deadline. I wanted to say that I started this paper, I incubated and wrote the first draft of this paper when I worked as a postdoc legal fellow at the Center on Reproductive Rights and Justice at Berkeley Law. And the question that got me started thinking about the comparison between reproductive justice and aid in dying is that in the context of aid in dying, there was this robust discussion about how various aspects or multiple layers of oppression and systemic oppression affects patient decision-making in the context of end-of-life decisions. So there's this discussion about how poverty, racism, disability, discrimination against the disabled, lack of healthcare access affects choices at the end of life. And yet we don't see that same discussion in the context of reproductive rights, healthcare, and justice. And so I started looking at aid in dying, and I will tell you that I'm a reproductive rights and justice scholar, and so I didn't know much about aid in dying. And so as I began to research the issue, I was amazed to see how much discussion there is in both sort of public discourse and in court opinions that acknowledges and expresses concern over how issues of poverty, disability, lack of healthcare access, et cetera, lack of family support impacts end-of-life decision-making. So, for example, the California Catholic Conference issued a daily fact sheet in opposition to California's Compassionate Choices Act. And this was a sheet that was to be used as talking points by priests and parishioners to talk to their legislators in opposition to this aid in dying legislation. And in this daily fact sheet, it says, and I quote, "Legalizing physician-assisted suicide puts incredible pressure on the terminally ill to choose to die, especially those who are uninsured, ill, disabled, old, or poor." And the Supreme Court in Washington v. Glucksberg has a lot of discussion about this idea in their oral arguments, lots of questions put to the attorneys. And in their court opinion in Washington v. Glucksberg, which you might remember is the case in which the Supreme Court failed to recognize a constitutional right to physician-assisted death, the court said, quote, "The risk of harm is greatest for the many individuals in our society whose autonomy and well-being are already compromised by poverty, lack of access to good medical care, advanced age, or membership in a stigmatized social group." So there's this well-accepted narrative that addresses how decision-making in these contexts are impacted by social, economic, and political structures. And this framing is what the RJ framework is hoping to import or bring out in the context of reproductive rights, healthcare, and justice. Indeed, if I were to read these quotes and swap in reproductive healthcare access in place of end-of-life care, we'd be getting pretty close to what we're thinking about when we're thinking about how systemic structures impact decision-making for individuals. So, you know, the RJ framework considers how multiple forms of oppression and structural inequalities come to bear upon the ability of individuals and communities to exercise meaningful choice across the continuum of their reproductive lives, including the right to have children, the right not to have children, and the right to raise children that we do have in dignity. And so as I began to look at these two movements and to consider them side by side, I came to the conclusion that the movements are moving in opposite trajectories between framings of healthcare and framings of choice. So that, and they are in fact accelerating in those directions. And so I argue in this paper that the aid in dying, or AID, when it was first put forth, it was put forth as the right to die. And it was personified by Dr. Jack Kevorkian, who was a pathologist. He did not have a doctor-patient relationship with the people that he helped to die. And he did not do an examination, and he saw his work as a service. And so Jack Kevorkian comes to represent this idea of the right to die, the right of an individual to make a choice at the end of their life to die. started happening sort of in the mid-90s and accelerated when the Washington v. Glucksberg decision came down, was that there was this transformation in the way that aid in dying was conceptualized. And Dr. Timothy Quill in the early 90s wrote an article and called for death with dignity. And in it, he put forth a completely different idea of aid. He described his long-term doctor-patient relationship with his patient Diane, who was suffering from cancer. And over the course of 4 years, he treated her. They engaged in conversations about her decision-making, her options. And at the end, she decided to terminate her life, and he helped her with that. And so Dr. Quill came to be the sort of the beginning of this shift in thinking about aid in dying from a rights framing of Dr. Kevorkian to a healthcare framing. And alongside his call for death with dignity, there was also a groundswell of a grassroots movement to change the social support and the legal rights and the healthcare experience of people who were facing the end of life. And so, on the legal rights front, they passed, legislation nationwide for living wills, for the right DNR, do not resuscitate orders. They, in the context of offering social support to families and to individuals who are facing the end of life, was the hospice movement. In 1974, there was one hospice care facility in the entire United States, and by 2010, there's hospice in all 50 states, and in many states it is either state-supported or there's state law that requires that health insurance cover it. And similarly, there's been this dramatic change in training of doctors for end-of-life care, so that there used to be zero training for doctors in end-of-life care, and most doctors chose not even to tell their patients that they were dying. They would just keep it to themselves. And so there was this change in the way doctors are trained to talk with patients about the end of life and to offer palliative care. So the most dramatic thing that I saw in this change from Kevorkian to Quill, if you will, if we can use those two as sort of the framing, is this dramatic reconceptualization from a rights framing to this contextualized choice of aid in dying as something that is healthcare, that is a change from an individual right of decision-making to a focus on the process of dying more generally, from the decision about terminating one's life to the process of dying. And that process of dying deserves social support and legal rights and healthcare access and dignity. So then I turned to the abortion right, and I found, and I have argued before, that the abortion right is going in the opposite trajectory. It began as a right that was integrally related to healthcare. In Roe v. Wade, the Supreme Court identified the abortion right as inherently and primarily a medical decision. And while there are many, and it wasn't included in this chopped up abstract in which I gave you just the areas where I was hoping to get some feedback, I promise you that I do a thorough job of saying how problematic that paternalistic healthcare framing was, because it subordinated women's decision-making to the decision-making of and the judgment of their doctors. But nevertheless, in the early abortion decisions, the court consistently identified abortion as integrally related to healthcare and supported healthcare access, abortion-related healthcare access, as part of the right of abortion. And as the abortion right has developed over the last 40-plus years, we see that the abortion right has been narrowed significantly to a right of decision-making or a right of choice. And the Supreme Court's analysis suggests that so long as a woman's decision-making is preserved, her right of abortion is preserved, completely severed from questions of access to abortion-related health care. And so my argument is that at this point, the abortion right is looks much more like the rights framing of Dr. Kevorkian than it does like the contextualized healthcare decision-making of Dr. Quill. In addition to this transition of the court's analysis and our understanding of abortion as exclusively a right of choice, it has also not only constricted what we understand the abortion right to be, but it has also constricted our conceptualization of what it means to have reproductive rights, so that we have become almost exclusively focused on abortion. And it has, and court won victories, as is, has been discussed in many contexts, and it has precluded the ability to sort of pull back the lens and think of reproductive rights in the larger context across the continuum of women's of people's reproductive lives. And so, again, it's a similar tension that we see in the aid in dying movement. If Kevorkian considered the right of decision-making at death, and Quill thought that we need to think about the process of dying more generally, our current framing of the abortion right as a right of decision-making or choice of individuals at the threshold of abortion, yes or no, and fails to take into account the myriad of social, economic, and political structures that impact decision-making for individuals and communities. So drawing upon the Death with Dignity movement and the RJ framework, I call for a broader vision of healthcare, one that is grounded in dignity and undergirded by healthcare access, social support, and legal rights. I describe in the paper, it wasn't included in what I gave you, but I described that dignity is an animating theme that runs both through the abortion case law and the aid in dying. And in both contexts, there's a need to recognize how poverty, disability, racism, lack of healthcare access, to name only a few, how structural and oppressions affect choice in both of these contexts. So this transition from Kevorkian to Quill and from reproductive rights to reproductive justice acknowledges that decision-making in these contexts takes place within a myriad of social structural relationships and restraints. They both seek to enhance patient decision-making by addressing the underlying structural oppressions that deny individuals of meaningful choice in these contexts. And in closing, I want to say that, my short-term goal is to try and deepen my discussion in this paper, because I think this paper, its analysis fits in well with the topic of this workshop. But as I am reading all of the incredible papers and hearing this robust discussion of vulnerability and reproductive justice, and it makes me think I might not be able to do it justice in this one paper by sort of enhancing this one paper. So I think I might need to look at these two movements through a framework of the vulnerability theory, because I think it would be a nice fit. So that might be a future project of mine. But in the meantime, I'm very much looking forward to your feedback on how you see these two movements and how they might fit within this larger theme for the workshop.
Thank you so much. That was fantastic. I will start with you. We'll begin themes that go through at least some of the papers, and how that might relate to questions about vulnerability. I was struck by how relevant the question of framing is, like how you frame the issue. Is it a rights? Is it a needs-based argument? Is it structure? Is it individual autonomy? And also why rhetoric matters. I have to thank Noya for talking about London, because I kind of feel like I've been writing about Mary Glendon my entire career, and I feel like I'm one of the few people that writes about her. But it's very interesting because if you think about the phases of Mary Ann Glendon, abortion and divorce in Western American law was kind of her most moderate comparative look, where she, and this is an interesting question about framing, what would be so bad about having the French system? Women say they're in distress, they get public funding, public facilities, versus the U.S., where, we have the right to privacy, but we really don't have in many states public funding or public facilities, and it just gets worse and worse. And then in rights talk, she's still sort of saying, look at the German example, why do we have this isolated model? And the interesting thing is the argument that this isn't what women need. Women don't want isolating privacy rights. They don't need isolating privacy rights. What they really need is a caring, supportive society versus irresponsible men and an uncaring, indifferent society that doesn't support mothers, right? And then after Casey comes out, she joins